I'd like to talk with you about is what design can do. Actually, so what is happening in design? Where is design moving these days? What is new? What's coming up? And what is the potential for design in the future? So that's what I want to talk with you about. So, as said in the introduction, my name is Kees Dorst. I've got a background in design and in philosophy. And you have to understand that design and philosophy are quite solid fields, and in between is a kind of marshland, and that's where I sit. And I try to fill that with books, basically, doing research into how designers think and trying to develop up new methodologies for design and around design. But for the subject of now, and by the way, one of the books has been translated into Spanish and many other languages, so some of you may know it. Thank you. So to move forward with understanding where design fits in the world in the future, we probably have to look at the world a little bit more closely. It's probably what you ask when you ask a philosopher to step forward, they first step back. And I guess we can say that somehow when you look in the press, when you look at the news, when you look at everything that's happening, somehow we're not solving our problems anymore. And that should actually be surprising for us. We've got very sophisticated organizations, public sector organizations, companies. We're more highly educated than ever, and things go wrong, and things go more wrong than ever. That's the feeling that we've got. So why is that? What is the matter with us? Why aren't we actually resolving these issues that come towards us? And I guess for me, thinking about it, it is because the problems in the world have become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked than ever before. We've basically networked ourselves, globalization, the internet, which means we've networked all the good stuff, but we've also networked all the bad stuff. And what does this actually mean for organizations? The organizations we work in as designers or the organizations we work for as designers? Well, generally, an open problem means that there's no boundaries. So it's really unclear to see, if you just look at the stakeholders, who's in and who's out. The idea that a problem is set and it has a context, no, you're never quite sure, and that might actually change over time. Other parties might become more important as you're solving the problem. Complexity means that there's many elements and relationships. It also means that there's many, because we know how to deal with that, but in real complexity, there's also relationships between the relationships, interdependencies, and then something really tricky happens. We like to think that, okay, if we do this, then this will be the result. But if everything is very networked, we do this and lots of things start to move. It's really, really hard. You lose direct causality. You can't say, this, I do this, and then that will happen. Problems have also become very dynamic, so they really change over time. So you can't say to the rest of the world, well, if everybody now holds their breath for about half a year, we'll solve this problem and then we'll implement the solution. Because by that time, the world will have moved on. You actually need to be out there in the open, problem solving in the environment as it is changing. And problems are networked. That actually probably means that solutions are also networked, which is really difficult, because how do you make money on a solution that's not your own? You can't own the problem anymore and say it's only mine, but the solution is also probably not only going to be yours. And if you want to cut a long story very short, if the problems of the world have become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked, the organizations of the world in the end will also have to become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked, because a successful organization mirrors their environment. And the better they're at it, the more they will thrive. But how do organizations react to this? They go for control. I mean, the whole world is actually moving. It's becoming much more fluid. And what they want is certainty. So you hear more stuff about KPIs than ever before. Let's set these roles and judge people on this. You get real confusions between risk and uncertainty in organizations, which is really, really stupid, because risk is something that you can actually understand and then decide to move away from. Uncertainty is something you don't understand yet, and you have to move towards it. But if every uncertainty is seen as a risk, then you don't move, basically. You're completely stuck innovation-wise. So you see organizations actually getting more stuck because the world around them is moving around them. Another nice one is best practices. You hear so many things about best practices, but actually a best practice is something that worked in the past. In a very quickly moving world, there's no guarantee that that will actually work in the future. So beware of best practices. Not easy. And so what's actually the cause of this? What's the problem here? And I guess the central one that I want to pick out for this talk is about complexity. Because what is it to actually live as an organization or as a person in an incredibly complex situation? Well, when I talk to my design students, I first have to say, well, with complexity, sorry, forget solutions. We are not going to solve this. Complexity means that there's a very complex situation, and what you need to do is you need to create interventions that move that whole situation to a better state. Trying to solve something is out of the question in a really complex environment. So that's a completely different game. It actually means that we need to forget about problem solving. But then our organizations are problem solving machines. They're made to solve a certain kind of problem in a certain way, but you can't actually. And if you try to problem solve, the only way you can do that is by doing a lot of simplification up front, making lots and lots of assumptions. That's actually where you introduce risk, because risk is making wrong assumptions. So how do you deal with that? And you actually see it in politics, you see it everywhere, that people that are popular are the ones that simplify the most. So populism comes up because it's always an easy yes, no, black, white thing, because people find it really tricky to live in the very complex world that we live in. Yet, because they don't know how to deal with it, basically. Yet, that complex world is the reality, and the simplifications are not. Another thing is, you have to actually forget about projects. Because a project is something that goes from a problem to a solution again. You're basically problem solving again, although you're doing it in a very creative way, probably. But no, in a very complex situation, that what looks to be a solution is actually the next step in the development of something bigger. So I'll show you an example in a minute where we've actually done a project, but 12 years later, we're still working there, because new things start to emerge and you keep acting on those things. But then, if you're looking at design education, you always learn how to do projects. You don't learn how to do these kind of programs. And that's where design needs to really start thinking about itself. I think design has a lot going for it. I think design is incredibly important, and I'll try and show that. But design also has a lot to learn to deal with these things. And in the end, what you're doing in complexity is you're navigating. You're trying to find your way through complexity, which is not an undesignedly thing to be doing, but it works slightly differently. So the question is how? And I've got 4 little things that I want to tell you, moving from the design space to more of an organizational space and a societal space, and see whether time allows me to do it, or otherwise they'll just shut off my phone. So, what design can do? I think one of the things that we can learn from design is that notion of a problem is not real. Problems are things that we decide to be a problem. They're not reality out there. I like this quote from Albert Einstein, Uncle Albert, saying, a problem can never be solved in the context to which it arose, which is a very clever thing to say and also a little bit of a stupid thing to say. It's a little bit stupid because if you can resolve something in its own context, you don't even call it a problem. You just call it life and you get on with it. But what he does say is that, okay, a problem is something that is stuck, and it is stuck and it comes from a certain context. And in my life, I've sort of had really the best job in the world, trained up as a designer, traveling around the world, interviewing and observing top designers, learning how they do things. And one of the things that I realized, I mean, these are top designers, Philip Stark, etc. They're all known for their great solutions. When you go to their studios and see what they're doing, they spend about 70 or 80% of the time on the problem, looking at the problem, actually unpacking the context, and trying to find a new way in. They basically said, oh yeah, I get a brief, yep, but I'm not going to resolve that one, because we know it's stuck. We need to find a new way into that problem space, and that's what they're good at, and that's why they're such exceptional designers. So I studied them and realized that they were able to do that time and time again, so I thought, well, there must be a pattern behind that. So a new approach to a problem is called a frame. So what I created was a process, learning from all the things that they were doing, about how to create a frame. Now, I don't have time to take you through all of that process now, but I'll give you one example that gives you a bit of a flavor, and you can read about it, basically. And for the example, I want to bring you to King's Cross. So King's Cross is an area in Sydney where young people like to go out. And on a Good Friday night or Saturday night, it's about 30,000 of them. And the evening normally starts more or less like this. And then it turns into a little bit of this, pretty messy. And then all too often it ends up like that. Not really good. There's violence, things happen, it's not a good thing. So we got commissioned by the, I'll just go back to a nicer picture. We got commissioned by the city of Sydney to look at this. And they said, we have a problem in King's Cross with alcohol-related crime. Now that's a frame, because you say there's crime and there's alcohol and the two are related. So if you think logically, if you want to bring down crime, you do that by bringing down the alcohol, which is what they had tried to do. But it didn't make any difference whatsoever. So they thought, what is this? Another thing is, after every incident, of course, the police put out more policemen on the street every time. It didn't make any difference either. So I think, okay, this is one for us. It's really stuck. All the old solutions don't work anymore. So we really need to think about this completely differently. And but first we need to get away from something and basically say it's not a crime problem. It must be something else. So what I did with sort of my design staff and students, went to King's Cross, drank beer, did our ethnographic research, made lots of notes, especially in the beginning of the evening, to really find out what is happening there, what's the matter. And then you realize that, okay, the reason that this approach doesn't work is that there's no criminals, basically. There's no criminals for the police to put up and put in a jail cell. It's about 30,000 young people that want to have a good time, and they're really bad at it. So things go wrong, but that's not a crime problem. It's something else. And in the end, what we decided to do, again, I'll go back to a nicer picture because in the end, what we decided to do, looking at this situation, is say, well, maybe one of the frames that we can use, and again, there's a whole process to get there, is to say, well, actually, King's Cross, there's 30,000 young people that want to have a good time, and it's a bit of a disaster. What would be a comparable situation? And we came up with the frame of a music festival. And then what you can do is just compare, okay, what would you organize if you organize a music festival, and what have you organized in King's Cross? So if you organize a music festival, you make sure that people can get there and that people can get away, of course. In King's Cross, the peak of young people coming into the area is 1 o'clock at night. The last train leaves at 1:20. So you think, they're basically stuck there, which is not a good thing. You get bored, you don't know what to do, etc., etc. People get on each other's nerves. So it's actually boredom is more of a problem than alcohol-related violence, maybe. And from that one frame of a music festival, there came sort of 35 different solution directions that have all been implemented because they just make sense. Once you've seen it in this way, you can't unsee it anymore. If you organize a music festival, you make sure that you've got lots of these portable toilets everywhere, and you make sure that there's good signage towards them. In King's Cross, it's a public space. There's only 3 public toilets. One of them is at the police station, so nobody goes there. You think, solve it. Come on, solve it. Another thing, when you organize a music festival, you make sure that there's a couple of big acts where people want to go, but people have to wait to get in. And those big acts actually don't create the atmosphere. The atmosphere is created by smaller things that are happening continuously around the whole area. And in King's Cross, unfortunately, there's 4 big clubs that people want to go to, and there's nothing much else. So it's not a nice atmosphere for going out in, actually. Another thing is that when you say, well, let's use the music festival as a frame, that opens up that whole field of event design to learn from. So I got to talk with the guy who organizes the New Yorkie fireworks at Sydney, which is one of the bigger recurring events in the world. It's basically 2.6 million people that want to look at one bridge in one moment in time. How do you organize? And it's always a nice day in the city. You think, how do they do that? It turns out they completely rebuild the city to do that. Hundreds and hundreds of interventions. So just to name one, he said, well, with King's Cross, you've got a problem with the railway station because that's where people come out in droves. A train comes in and there's a high-density crowd. High-density crowds are problematic. So what you need to do is make sure that that crowd spreads very quickly. And he said, what you need is street music. Because street musicians play, some people move on, other people stay, and you're actually sort of making the crowd less dense. And he said, this is in Australia, he said, in Australia, you have to use salsa. I went, okay. But I can understand why not hard rock, because you want to keep the adrenaline down, but why? And why not tango? Hey. And he said, no, only salsa works, because people think they can dance to it. They can't, but they have a lot of fun trying and doing that. And it's not too funny when you're too drunk to do it, so people actually stay off alcohol and have a really good time. So now, at New Year's Eve, when I get to Sydney, there's just salsa music everywhere, basically. It's salsa central. So it's that kind of knowledge. But once you've seen that, it's very hard to go back to, okay, we need crime prevention things happening. It's a completely different issue. So lots of examples of the things that we did. But basically, the core of it is that you basically say, well, okay, there's an old frame, which is about alcohol-related violence, and the value that it tries to achieve is security and safety. And you can also say, well, it should be about vibrancy, and it should be about young people shaping their identity. Because a lot of the things that young people do in these kind of going out areas is look at each other all the time. So these are other values. And from those other values, you get up to things like a music festival as a possible frame for that situation. Now, this is something quite remarkable that these designers do, because normally in an organization, problems come in on an action level. We need to do something. And then you use your normal repertoire of things that you normally do to try and resolve the issue. So, and if that's good enough, it's good enough. It's absolutely great, no comments. Sometimes your action repertoire just isn't good enough, and you may go back to, maybe we need to approach this in a different way. So you go back to the methods level. What I saw these designers do time and time again is immediately go all the way back to the values level. What is this actually about? And be creative on that values level, and then create new actions, etc. from that. So it is a really different process. It's really special. And actually, when we're talking about complexity, navigating complexity, how can you navigate complexity when everything's moving all the time and everything is very, very complicated? You go back to the values level. That's actually relatively stable. It's relatively understandable. And from that values level, you can start to create new shapes of things. You can start to actually give form. So this is the absolutely crucial thing that we designers can bring. And that is needed, not in design, but in many, many, many other fields too. And this is what I've been doing. This is what I've been seeing in the last 10 years. It sort of got me all around the world, working in different cities, working with different governments, being on a group of Obama advisors, working for the UN, because the UN realizes that the big challenges that the world has are actually design challenges by now. They're still phrased as problems, but they're actually design challenges. We need to reinvent the way we live. So there was one. And you think, this is great, this is working, perfect. But actually, projects don't change the world, unfortunately. Doing lots and lots of projects, you've got lots of local good success, but you're not changing the system through that. What you actually want to do is, if you do a project, so you've got action, you reflect on it, you get insights out of that, you plan new actions, and you sort of go around like that. It's what we call the washing machine. So you go around and around and around, and you make money, which is a good thing, and you actually create local impact, which is also good. But what you really want to do is change the practices of the organization that you're working with, to really teach them how to do things differently. And actually, if this is a good frame and it's really different, then you probably need to influence the strategy of the organization, probably the structure, and maybe how the whole sector works. This is what you're trying to achieve. Well, sort of fast forward 20 years of my life running into walls, this doesn't work, unfortunately, because actually strategy is determined top-down, so you get stuck here, and you're sort of you're trying to swim against the river, more or less, trying to go upstream. So what we've actually learned to do is say, well, okay, where does an organization take its cue from? How does an organization think? Where does an organization learn? And we realized that let's not make any assumptions about any organization being innovative, because they tend to be not more innovative than they really need to be. But they are adaptive. They actually have this idea of, okay, this is the field that we're working in, and we need to adapt to that field. So what we've learned to do is not just design and try to go bottom up, but also use these insights to create new stories about the field. This is where the world is going for you, organization. So if you adapt to that, you'll actually see that we're already doing things that are harbingers of that new identity, of that new world. And so this is what we're doing now time and time again. And as I said, as designers, we're really good at that. We've had to learn that. But it's an absolutely important skill if you really want to change an organization, if you really want to change a system. Because a system only changes, or an organization only changes, when every layer changes, not just down here. You just get stuck, basically, in the long run. And you'll tire yourself out trying to push up. So creating this cycle is actually really important. And this is actually what's happened around the King's Cross project. So we did the project, and the city of Sydney realized that, and that project, by the way, was commissioned by the Safer Sydney Committee. So safety was in the name of the committee that gave us the money. And after the project, they renamed themselves to be about the nighttime economy, which is a much broader thing to be doing. And it's actually about stimulating the kind of nightlife that you want in the city. And not just in King's Cross, which is just a couple of streets, and the music festival frame works for a couple of nights a week, but in all different parts of the city. What do you want to happen there? So they actually became a kind of conductor of nightlife in the city. And they've really had to adapt their organization because they didn't know how to build these relationships with all kinds of parties in society that they should then collaborate with. They were used to having rules and and creating infrastructure. This is a different way of being. So this is part of their strategy document. It's kind of 150 different action points for different parts of the city, short-term, mid-term, long-term. Really professional job. They've had to change completely. They've hired lots and lots of designers, also UX designers, to be able to do this, because it's such a different game to be in for them. And this project has also sparked a whole network of mayors of the night in the world. So there's about 50 cities now that have a mayor for the nightlife. And Sydney is one of the host organizations because they're very proud that they're really good at this. So it's a real transformation of a council, of a municipality, of a city doing this. And it comes from bottom up. It comes from trying to sort of think through what is really needed. But it also comes from telling a different story about what it means to be a good city. So I can sort of, through the organization, send you some more links about this kind of work. It's really fascinating what they're doing. Okay, so again, this still sounds okay, right? So we've moved from a project level to changing an organization. But actually, when you take complexity seriously, you need to do something else. So we're now sort of, earlier this week I heard people talk about Buchanan's four levels of being a designer, with the strategic level being the highest one. I'm now going to talk about not level number 4, but number 5. Dick Buchanan is a good friend of mine. We always bicker about this. Because if you actually want sort of to deal with the problems of the world as they are, as complex as they are, you don't need a one-off change, a different frame and a different story. You need to be able to build continuous change. And it's not about resilience, which people like to talk about a lot. Resilience is, there's a system, there's a disturbance, and the system is able to deal with it and bounce back. But the system is not changing. So what we like to talk about is vitality. How do you create systems that are basically alive, that can keep changing as the world changes and actually shape those changes? And we talk about, this is part of my UN work, talk about future literacy. What is a healthy attitude for an organization towards the future? It's not the same as projecting the past. How do you deal with the future? How do you explore, etc.? And again, those are design questions. So what can design do there? Well, we have to look then at high-level design practices, and I'm really chuffed, sort of in the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of these practices already being named. So what I did at some point, I realized that, okay, I'm talking to these top architects, top designers, etc., etc. They all have their studios, they all have their offices, and in those offices, they're not involved in the projects. What they're doing is they're creating an environment in which their type of project can happen. But how does that work? It's not management, as you would learn getting an MBA or at a business school. It's actually about the content of the projects, but they're really good at stimulating this, and they're really good at creating a studio that keeps changing and changing and changing. And it turns out, when you start talking with them, they talk a lot, but there's tons and tons of different things that they do. And it's very, very subtle. It comes even down to, okay, these are the projects that we have on the wall now, because these are the things that we're still exploring. And Ken Young, who's an architect from Singapore, he talks about, okay, we're combining these different types of knowledge, and we sometimes use competitions to actually challenge the staff and make sure that the staff sort of work together, but we do that to actually learn ourselves about what our next step can be, etc., etc. So there's a hell of a lot of knowledge which has been very, very poorly mapped, I must say, about what do these people do. And it goes across the whole organization. So I was talking to Norman Foster, a famous British architect, and he was basically saying, well, one of the problems I have is that all the architects that apply for a job at Norman Foster are absolutely brilliant. Their portfolios are so beautiful. And in a job interview, they all sound good, they're all very eloquent, etc., etc. What we do is we normally hire a lot of them and we give them a 2-week contract, because we need to hire architects that are really good and that understand what we do and can actually sort of help support what we do, but can also challenge it in just the right way. You don't want people that are completely critical and just destructive. You want people to have that right amount of challenge to it. And he said, we hire people for 2 weeks. You actually, that's too long. You know after 2 or 3 days already whether it's going to work or not. So everything that they do is geared towards this kind of development. It's geared towards creating an organization around creativity rather than around production. And there's a lot of knowledge there that we haven't tapped into yet. But as I said earlier this week, I just heard snippets of it here and there. And I think it's really cool. I think we should sort of, it's a strength that we need. What I've been doing is actually learning from these people, from the research that I've done in this space. And what I'm doing, sort of working with government organizations, mostly at the moment, basically saying, well, if you want to have an organization that has vitality, you need a lab, because you need to be able to experiment. You need an academy, because you need to be able to learn and to actually express that learning to others, because you're shifting fields. You need a podium, because, and it's a really important one, you need very regularly to actually create moments where you're asking everybody for comment. And it does a couple of things. One of the internal things that, so normally I use a half year, so every half year there's a podium moment. And that means that you always have a quality discussion, because you've done your one sort of internal conference or whatever, get lots of feedback, and then you go, okay, in 6 months' time we're on stage again. What are we going to do then? So you're always talking about what are you about, what is good, what is not so good. You also become very good at understanding that, okay, in this iteration, we need to sort of, these people are important, but then the next step, to jump to the next podium, it's these other people that are more important, et cetera, et cetera. And you also need a temple, because basically this is about development, it's about growth, which is organizational growth. The organization needs to learn, but it's also personal growth, and you really need to take care of that. I mean, we had a talk about it this morning too. It's really, really important. And the thing with this is, if you forget one, it doesn't work. That's the trouble with learning cycles. They always need to be complete. If you miss one, it does not work at all. So what I'm trying to do is build these around different organizations. And basically, so again, learning from design, I'll just skip through that. But they're really transdisciplinary studios, in the sense that there's disciplines from across the organization that are involved in these studios, because innovation is a relay race. It doesn't sit in an innovation department. There's a spark somewhere, and you want impact at the end, and on the way, it touches all of the parts of the organization. So creating these studios, on the one hand, it's really hard. On the other hand, it's actually really easy, because we already have these networks within our own organizations or with your clients. You know who you can call. So I work at a university. If I need marketing for some new thing that I've developed up, I'm not going to call marketing. I'm going to call the one person at marketing that I know understands what I'm on about. So you already have these informal networks of allies across an organization. But those need to be complete. You just need to make sure that there's not a gap, or that there's one department that's fallen out of that, because that's where you'll get stuck with your innovation. So, and what I use to bring all of these different disciplines together are design processes, are design challenges. You need an open process that actually leads somewhere. Sounds like design to me, really. So again, this is a different role for design, kind of a fifth order of design, to actually start creating these things, which means that as a designer for an organization, as a creative in an organization, you also get into these different roles. You're still doing projects, but you're also doing these other things that I talked about. Last bit. So what are we up against? Well, actually, in the coming 10 years, we know we're going to go through lots of transitions. The way we deal with energy, the way we deal with healthcare, the way we deal with education, all of our systems are basically up for grab. So we are going to go through huge systems change. And sort of, this is my UN work on Sustainable Development Goals. These are all design questions, actually. This is not about problem solving. This is actually about creating new systems and about creating systems that can keep moving and learning, which is something that designers know how to do. And it's not because we're special. Well, we're a little bit special. But it is actually that these, if you're looking at the start of my talk, problems becoming more open, complex, dynamic, and networked, that's what designers have been dealing with all along, basically. So we've developed up practices that other fields are now also needing. So we are ahead of the game in that sense, and that can actually put us in a different role. So what can design do? A hell of a lot. I think we're sitting on a bit of a gold mine of practices that are only becoming more important into the future. And we really need to take care to actually start disseminating that. But it is a little bit strange, because sort of when you think about design way back, design was basically a pretty small discipline. You could sort of stand in it, more or less. And people would sort of have all these kind of expectations about what you would do and what you would deliver, and you actually, it's a box, basically. And you were really, really, really kept in that box. But what I see now, I mean, we talk about what design can do as if design is a thing. Well, it's not. But actually, what is design? Well, we are design. And look around you. We've got so much diversity here. We've got so many levels of thinking, so many people doing many, many different things. Design is actually a huge field, and design is actually really powerful. And I think design now needs to pick up that notion of, okay, we are part of that change that the world needs, and we can be some of those drivers because we have these practices. And so then it's not a small box, but a very big box. Okay, thank you.